Right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. We're really happy to have you here today. We have a jam-packed Learn at Home session about water equity and some actionable items actually from this Learn at Home today that we're excited to share with you. So if you don't know about our Learn at Home programming, we launched Learn at Home here at TreePeople post-COVID. When COVID started, because we really wanted to continue connecting with community members, sharing knowledge about the environment, having guest speakers talk about important topics around the environment. And we are sharing every other week doing live lessons. So please continue to join us. You can go to our website, treepeople.org/learn-at-home, sign up for our newsletter and continue to be connected. We have all sorts of topics: water, soil, native plants. Some of them are DIY, how to plant a native plant garden, or we have guest speakers like the other week we had a fire ecologist from the U.S. National Forest Service. So lots of fun and interesting topics. And you can also go on our website and see previous topics. We have videos, activities for kids. We also have activities for teachers and parents. And then also all of our live lessons are recorded and you can access them on our website. So thank you again for joining us today. And we'd really like to thank our sponsors. Learn at Home is free for all community members, and that's because of our sponsors. So we'd like to really thank the Senator Fund, as well as Boeing and Subaru of Sherman Oaks. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our team today to talk about water equity, which is the topic for today. So thank you, everybody. And if you have questions, please put it in the chat and we will be answering all those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, Stephen, go for it.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to talk about the WaterTalks program. So my name is Stephen Salazar-Caesar and I'm the Senior Manager of Community Organizing at TreePeople. And I'll let the rest of the team introduce themselves.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Jaime Del Rio. I am Community Organizer at TreePeople.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Ana Karen Ramirez. I'm our Water Equity Program Assistant. And this morning, I wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge that as we're talking about water management in this region, that we're actually talking about the ancestral lands of a lot of different tribes, the Tongva, the Tataviam, Chumash, Serrano, Kumeyaay, as well as Pacific Islanders of LA, and the Latin American indigenous diaspora that's present here as well as the original stewards of this land, and acknowledging that it's really important to repair a lot of those ties as traditional ecological knowledge that a lot of these communities hold will really work in a lot of the planning efforts that we make moving forward in this region.
All right, thank you, Ana Karen. Next slide, please. All right, so like I mentioned, we're here to talk about WaterTalks and water issues. So what is WaterTalks? So TreePeople and 12 other community organizations are working across LA County to hold over 50 public meetings and conduct a really massive public survey in an effort to increase community involvement in water management in California. So what that means is that we want to make sure that the concerns of community members, especially and particularly residents of underserved areas, are taken seriously when decisions are made. So basically, we want the health and safety and welfare of these communities to be at the forefront of every decision when it comes to the environment, but particularly around water issues. So how we're doing that is, like I mentioned, we're doing 50 community educational meetings across the county to talk to people, hear about what they're going through when it comes to these issues, provide some education on how water impacts their lives and health, and help them become advocates for their communities around water issues. And we're also, again, holding this survey project where we want to hear from thousands of people across the county to gather data on the needs and challenges that they face in different communities across LA. And so that way we have evidence and demonstration of the needs of these communities so that actual projects like parks and wetlands and rainwater capture systems are built to actually address these concerns. And we also, when we think about how water impacts our lives, we'll be discussing this later in the presentation, but this graphic really encapsulates it well. So I think the first and foremost, the biggest one is clean water. How do we know, and how do we make sure that the water that comes out of our tap that we use to hydrate ourselves, that we use to cook and clean, and our sanitation needs, how do we make sure that it's safe? And how do we hold the people who provide our water accountable? Flood protection, we're going to be talking about this as well. So how do we make sure that our communities, with how built up Los Angeles is, with the built environment being so focused on buildings and concrete and streets and asphalt, how do we protect ourselves from flooding when it rains? And my colleague Jaime will talk about his experience with that later. And also, the bottom four kind of talk about health and well-being and how that water impacts that. So that could mean, making sure that we manage our drainage systems and that there's those diseases that are vector-borne from standing water, that we're safe from them. And also, how do we make our communities greener, and how do we increase access to natural spaces and parks and waterways that we know have a huge impact on our mental and physical health? And so all of these issues can be addressed by the funding and the projects that we're talking about here. So as we go through the presentation, we want you to be thinking about what you experience in your daily life. And so the next thing we'll do is actually a poll. So Ariel will be kind enough to launch the poll for you all. And we want to hear about what the greatest concern when it comes to water in your community is. So go ahead and take a few minutes to fill out that poll. And it actually asks you to select your top 3. So a couple early votes for trash and other pollution, drinking water quality, high cost of water. That's something we're going to be discussing in a bit. Need for more shade, trees, and landscape. That's obviously important to us at TreePeople. Awesome, thank you. So it looks like trash and other pollution in streets and waterways was a big concern. So we'll be definitely talking about that, how urban runoff impacts our health, and also drinking water quality and high cost of water. So those are things we're going to be talking about today. So I appreciate you all sharing that. So we move on to the next slide. And one more after that, please. So, and so why are we doing all this work? So all of the input that you just gave is input we want from the rest of the community in Los Angeles. And the reason why we need that is because there's a ton of funding out there to actually build projects that would actually address the needs that residents experience every day. And so, but if we leave these decisions to the people who make these decisions without really demonstrating what our communities are going through, the things that are built won't necessarily reflect what the community needs. And so it's important to have this evidence to support this investment, because the communities that we're talking about for far too long have not been properly invested in. And as a result, they face the most negative health impacts from the environment that surrounds them. So really quickly, Proposition 1 was a statewide bond from a few years back that provided $7.5 billion for water-related projects. This project itself is funded by Proposition 1 and can go to lead to projects that are funded by it. But that's a one-time funding source. We're lucky in LA County that Measure W, which was passed in 2018, actually provides $300 million a year for water-related projects, stormwater capture projects. And so what that means is that every year in Los Angeles County, there's $300 million for projects. And so we want to make sure that as much of that money as possible goes to the communities that need it the most. And next, please. And so who makes these decisions, right? So this is a complicated world. Water in California is one of the most complicated issues, but I'll just kind of try to explain it really briefly. So to advocate for your community, you need to know who's in charge. And so for water, these are the integrated regional water management planning system. So all these types of boards all across the county, and it's broken up by regions and subregions. And so you could essentially think of it like Congress or a city council, but for water. And locally, there are 5 subregions, and depending on where you live, you have different people making these decisions. So I live on the east side of LA, and so I'm within the Upper LA River subregion, which means that they're the people that make decisions on funding that will go to my community. And so we encourage you to figure out who represents you. And these are the people that need to hear from you and learn about your concerns. And so just like any other public entity, they're accountable to you. And so we want to make sure that you know who they are and that you interact with them. So there's some information on that link below, and we could share these slides with you afterwards. But if you need help, figuring that out, we're happy to help you with that. Next, please. And so the thing that is the foundation for all of this work is equity. And so what we mean by equity is making sure that all people have equal protection from the environment, equal protection and access to resources. And so what you're looking at here is a map of Los Angeles. And so if you see that black dot in the middle there, and Ariel might be able to find it with the cursor so you can see, that's downtown Los Angeles. And what the different colors are, I should say this is a tool called Cal EnviroScreen. What the different colors are the different percentiles of the communities that have the highest pollution burden, so the most negative impacts from pollution on the environment, as well as economic burden. And so the red areas, if you look at the legend down there, those communities are in the top 10 percentile of polluted areas in the state. And as we know, California is, so goes the country. So if you're the most polluted in California, there's a good likelihood you're among the most polluted in the entire country. So if you notice these areas, so like if that's downtown LA, it goes into South LA, some of South Bay and Southeast LA County. It also goes up to the Northeast San Fernando Valley, out towards the San Gabriel Valley is very red, and then into the Inland Empire. And so if I were to overlay this map with a demographic map, we know that those red areas and those orange areas particularly are where Black and brown people live. And so we know that the people, our neighbors, that suffer the most from the built environment and from pollution and water issues and lack of trees and extreme heat are Black and brown people. And so it's important that their concerns and their needs and their challenges are put at the forefront because they're the people that are impacted the most. And so I just wanted to mention that so you have an idea of what these communities are going through. And when we describe some of the challenges later in the presentation, this is what happens every day for people that live in these communities. And so, yeah, so that's the basis of what we're doing here. So next, please. And so how are we making sure that we hear from those communities? So as I mentioned, TreePeople is working with 12 other community organizations to interact with community members, talk to them, learn from them, gain expertise from them to understand what's going on in these communities and how this funding can be put towards addressing them. So I was glad to see my colleague Martha on the call. She is social ecoeducation. She's a community organizer that does really great work around water and interacting with people and making sure that their voices are taken seriously. But if you live in LA, you may notice or recognize some of these groups. We have environmental justice groups. We have a land trust that buys up land to maintain affordable housing. We have education and social justice groups. We have a group that focuses on Indigenous outreach. And I think these groups under normal work don't necessarily work on environmental issues, but they all see the nexus of water and the environment and how important it is for the health of their communities. And that's why they're doing this work with us. And so we're very thankful to be partners with them. And they're helping us carry forward the work of getting this data, talking to people, and making sure that we represent well these communities in this process. So next. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Ana Karen, who will be talking about how we interact with water in our environment and how that could impact our lives.
Thank you, Stephen. So to learn a little bit more about water equity, I'm going to set the stage for how water moves through our environment, specifically the greater Los Angeles region, because by understanding our water history, we'll be better able to understand how to protect this vital resource for ourselves and for future generations, and to better protect those communities, as Stephen mentioned, who are most impacted by this nexus of socio-political and environmental stressors. And so essentially Los Angeles, or the greater Los Angeles region, has 5 major watersheds. And that's the LA River, the San Gabriel River, Bayona Creek, Santa Monica Bay, and Dominguez Channel. And essentially a watershed is any land area that channels rainfall, snowmelt into creeks, streams, and rivers that flow into a common outlet such as reservoirs, bays, and for our case, the Pacific Ocean. So on this map, you can see which watershed you live in. I myself am where that little star is in the LA River watershed. And the watershed consists of both surface water, like lakes, streams, reservoirs, and wetlands, and also underlying groundwater. Next slide, please. So surface and groundwater, they're both essentially one interdependent resource. As we know, water is not stagnant, it moves through everything. And both groundwater and surface water are physically connected through the hydrological cycle, where water evaporates, forms into clouds, and then falls onto the ground as rain or snow. Then this precipitation seeps into the ground and moves slowly into an underground aquifer and eventually becomes groundwater. And so next slide, please. This diagram here shows how we can work a little bit more dynamically with the topography of our landscape to capture rainwater or use other natural resources like wastewater collection and recycling systems, trees that slow and spread water to these underground reservoirs, as well as other rainwater collection and bioretention systems. Next slide, please. And so it's crucial to continue replenishing our groundwater, which is stored in our aquifers and is pumped from underground using wells. And this is crucial because they are a buffer against drought when surface water levels like lakes and reservoirs start to run low. And when groundwater is extracted in excess to what nature or man-made recharge efforts can replenish, that's when groundwater elevations start to drop. And this ends up causing the ground to gradually sink, which is called subsidence. And it's important for LA to continually replenish its underground reservoirs, especially in times of drought, because this ensures that we are self-reliant, sustainable, and don't contribute to subsidence, which is important not only for ourselves, but for the rest of the state, considering that folks in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, where we get a lot of our water from, which Jaime will describe a little bit more of later, they have experienced increasing subsidence due to LA receiving water from that. And as we know, there are a lot of economic effects as well, causing infrastructural damage because of this, which ends up really increasing the cost and decreasing the quality of water for everyone in the state. Next slide, please. And so ways that we can both continually replenish our systems that hold our water more here in Los Angeles, as well as creating benefits for the rest of the community, is through parks and local waterways, which offer benefits that encompass a lot of different areas in our lives. So here is an image of an urban park in LA, a natural urban park in LA, but it doesn't really have to look like this. This can be a community garden, bike paths, trails, which ultimately we know create vibrant and healthy communities. they regulate the air temperature, they reduce air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, noise from the city. They capture stormwater runoff and protect habitat for wildlife, for urban wildlife, which really, as we know, don't have too many places to go as well. These spaces also strengthen community and can reduce crime when we think of giving youth in our areas more space to actually recreate, because if people don't have space, they will find it eventually, and we want to ensure that folks are in a safe place when they are recreating. There's also a myriad of mental health benefits. Proximity to parks and natural spaces improve moods, they lengthen lifespans and reduce stress, as well as physical health and well-being benefits. So anyone who is in walking distance from a park is likely able to receive the adequate amount of physical exercise necessary in a day. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, many communities with low household incomes and communities of color have few or no green spaces at all. And likely existing parks and recreation areas are poorly maintained, understaffed, unwelcoming, and unsafe. I know this is the case for myself. On the right is also my area where I grew up in Northeast San Fernando Valley. There's only a few pockets, just scattered little pieces of green there that you can see. And the only really big recreation area right now that I would have access to, Hansen Dam, is currently used as a COVID testing site. And other areas now, due to COVID, are also understaffed and closed. And so areas that normally were not fenced up and I had access to before are now closed. And this is the time where we also see that people need to be outside the most. And so I definitely feel the impacts of this, and I know communities like mine as well feel that impact. And if you see the image on the left, that is another graphic that shows how inequities in park access across neighborhoods are really a result of policies, laws, and practices that have segregated communities along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. And it's not a coincidence that communities are and parks and green spaces are a lack in their area as well. And that's why it's important to advocate for legislation, funding, and community-based efforts like WaterTalks that focus around planning, effective planning to combat this issue. Next slide, please. So how do contaminants get into our water? When land is paved, water isn't able to sink into the ground. Therefore, water that flows over hardened landscape is then directed into storm drain systems that lead straight into rivers and oceans. And so what this untreated water is called is urban runoff. And urban runoff carries pollutants such as automotive fluids, trash, pesticides, everything that you see on your sidewalk is just carried straight into the ocean. Trash, bacteria from pet waste, aging septic tanks, litter, all of that, dust from brake pads, all ends up in our groundwater aquifers, local streams. And we see that in areas that are already heavily industrialized and don't have access to these green and open spaces, don't benefit from those environmental filtration processes, and therefore the water in those areas locally is more polluted. And that's why after rain here in LA, it's not safe to go and visit the beach because all of those contaminants and pollutants are concentrated there. Next slide, please. And so the image on the right is one that maybe most folks are familiar with, and that's what's now known as the LA River. But the image to the left actually shows what the river was like before settlers and before colonization in this area. And what is now this really straight concrete channel was once over 500 square miles of meandering tributaries with a largely flat floodplain. And it's now covered by streets, freeways, and houses. And for much of the year, the stream was just like a trickle, and it would seasonally flood. And after a while, once folks started coming in and their homes were destroyed through this seasonal flooding, the Army Corps of Engineers systematically transformed the LA River from this intermittent meandering stream, which was bordered by willows, sycamores, and cottonwoods, into a concrete storm drain that we all see in passing today. And essentially, the purpose of this was for water to go as directly and quickly as possible to the ocean. And we are all suffering the effects of that today. And two ways that you can more closely monitor the water quality before recreating in any space, or even the water quality from your tap. You can visit the California Water Quality Monitoring Council and Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. So those are two links here that you can go and look at to find out more about the local water in your area. And to talk a little bit more about flooding and some ways to mitigate that is Jaime. So I'll pass it off to Jaime.
Thank you, Anna Karen. Good morning, guys. So I'll be discussing flooding in our community. So am I a risk of flooding? As you guys can see, this map indicates our flood zones in our community, where we have our red as being, which is our 100-year flood zone, which is, it not necessarily mean that it happens every 100 years. It more means that it could happen, it's a 1% chance of an annual of it occurring in a flood zone. So then we also have our 500-year flood, which is 0.2% chance of it happening annually. And you can see that a lot of the flood zones are actually located in Sun Valley, and there's some in Pacoima where we're covered by Hansen Dam. And this brings back to some of the issues I experienced as I live in Sun Valley. So that's one of the things I experience a lot. And of course, localized flooding may occur within and beyond our flood zones, which means that because of so much concrete in our communities, flood zones can happen in areas that don't necessarily occur in those flood regions that we have here in this map. So these could be areas where there's a lot of concrete and water is unable to percolate into the ground because there's just so much concrete. And next slide. And then just as I mentioned earlier about me living in Sun Valley. So I grew up in Sun Valley, and I still live in Sun Valley. And as a child, I remember going to school and walking home when it would rain. I would experience my neighborhood being constantly flooded. So I would walk home and I would get wet, I would be soaked, and I would arrive home, and then my mom will be telling me, go take a shower before you get sick. And then of course, I'm walking in that contaminated water as well, because it rains and then it's carrying all those contaminants. So of course, it could definitely have an impact on your health as well. So it's very important to reduce the concrete in our community. So that way we don't see that kind of urban runoff carrying into our community. So, and one of the greatest advantage of it in my community that a couple of years ago, TreePeople built Elmer Street, where we pretty much, they resurfaced the street where it would be able to capture water. And the good thing about that water capture project is that it didn't quite fully reduce it, but it reduced the impact of flooding in my community. There's still more to be done. We're still experiencing flooding, but of course, it's just small little things that help our community not get flooded and not become like an urban lake. And which is a great benefit about how we have WaterTalks, the WaterTalks program. We could use those funding sources to really reduce our impact in flooding. So then that's what brings us back to the next slide. Okay, so now we have, so how does land use affect our water? So as I mentioned, concrete has a big impact on how water is moved through our communities. The more concrete we have, which in this diagram, it's gray. So that's where you have all this urban environment where there's a lot of concrete communities. So when it rains, the water cannot flow correctly into the natural built environment. So that's where you have some areas that they get flooded, that they're not prone to flooding, where we experience flooding, and regions that shouldn't even get flooded. So we have here that land use affects how water moves through our communities. In urban communities, land use can range from open space and agriculture. Developed land often consists of impervious surfaces such as asphalt and concrete. Where land is paved, water is not able to soak into our ground system. Instead, water flows over the hardened landscape when it's channeled into our storm drain system, diverting millions of gallons of water into our river and ocean. And that, instead of capturing that water, which is like precious gold, precious blue gold, we're actually, it becomes wasteful. So that water runs into our oceans, and you have all that urban runoff, which is full of contaminants. It contaminates our ocean. So that's why they say whenever it rains, never swim in our oceans, which is kind of hazardous. And it's really, really sad that we cannot experience that when it rains. Of course, you have the water running through our ocean, and it contaminates our ocean. Okay. And then, of course, too much water running through our streets can result in communities getting flooded or eroded, and water becomes a hazard with running untreated water through our streets. And also we have this untreated water, which is urban runoff, which carries pollutants from car fluid, trash, and pesticides. It is our biggest source of pollutant in our rivers and oceans. So what can we do to mitigate these impacts? Next slide, please. So these are some ways to mitigate our impact. Sorry, I think the screen went dark there. All right. Yes, it's okay. Sorry about that. All right. So these are some ways to mitigate our impact with capturing water. So one of the greatest advantage about WaterTalks program is that we're able to use funding to reduce we could reduce water being released to the ocean. So by capturing water before hitting our rivers, ocean helps our streets from getting flooded, keeps our oceans and rivers clean, replenishes our groundwater, and reduce our dependence on imported water. The great advantage of WaterTalks, as I mentioned, is that we're able to fund these projects. Some examples of capture rainwater, it could be bioswale by curb cutting. So on this picture to the left where the stop sign is, it's a bioswale, which is it's pretty much the curb is cut certain inches, and when it rains, the water is able to percolate. The water is able to enter that curb, and the water pretty much sits in that bioswale, and then the water essentially goes down into our water system. So it kind of creates like a pond, like a little small pond where the water sits there until it naturally goes down into our system. And then we also have our rain gardens. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but LADWP was providing rain gardens to certain communities where you're able to capture some of the rainwater. So instead of that rainwater being diverted into the concrete floor or into like the ocean, you actually capture that rainwater and you're able to use it to water the grass, water your plants or your drought tolerant landscape that you have in your home, which is pretty good. Instead of that water being gone to the ocean, it becomes polluted, you're able to capture it and then you're able to use it for future uses, which is pretty amazing how you're able to capture something from nothing and then you're able to use it for later uses. And then you also have to the right the rain gardens, where removing concrete from your backyard, it creates more of a landscape, more natural landscape, but also it looks nicer, looks more natural because of course concrete increases heat in your home. So the more concrete you have, the more asphalt, the hotter it is, it's going to be in your backyard. So by removing that concrete, you actually have more like a natural landscape. And then you also allow the water to do what nature does, just let it percolate down into our water system, and then it replenish our aquifers, which is pretty amazing too. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk briefly about where our water comes from. Next slide. So on this map, it shows us where does our water come from. So as you can see, I'm sure some of you guys might be aware or not, but 62% of our water is imported, which is quite a big number, because if the snowpacks and there's no rain in the Sierra Nevada, or doesn't rain in NorCal, we are prone to having a drought in our communities. So we need to reduce that number to make it more localized. So when there's a future drought, we're able to tap into our local water sources. So and then of course, WaterTalks is able to help us with that, where we focus more on local water. So we'll be able to reduce our reliance on imported water. So then we also have 1% of local surface water, and then also 37% on groundwater. But also wanted to keep in mind is that if we don't replenish our groundwater, that number, that percentage can be reduced, where WaterTalks will help replenish our groundwater, which is pretty important, that we have funding to be able to focus a lot in local water. So when there's a future drought, we won't really necessarily be affected that much, because we're being tapping into our local water sources. Okay, and next slide, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Jaime. So now we're going to get into the water that we actually consume and that we drink. And so we'll be launching a poll here, and we want to know where you get your drinking water. So there's a few options. So we have the bottled water that you buy from the store, those big water jugs that you either get delivered or you fill up at the store, or tap water. Or if you don't drink water and you're out there dehydrated, you can select that one too. Thankfully, no one's selecting I don't drink water. That's good. All right, so early lead is with tap water, and the winner is tap water, with a few people drinking bottled water and water jugs. So thank you for sharing. So we're going to go over why I asked and why that's important. All right, so the average person drinks about 8 cups of water per day, which is about a half a gallon, which comes out to about 180 or 182.5 gallons per year. So that's just, your run-of-the-mill person with a normal drinking water average. So to the few people that buy a bottle of water, the annual cost for one person at that rate is $1,400 per person. So if you have a family of 4, multiply that by 4 and so on, you're spending a good amount of money on bottled water, a resource that is free, or not free, but it is available to us in cheaper forms. So for those of you that get the water jug, so the one right next to it, if you get them delivered to your home, you're probably spending between $360 to $900 a year per person. If you go and get them refilled yourself, you're probably spending in the range of like $60 to $70 per person. But for those of you that drink tap water, you're actually spending about $1.50 a year per person. So between $1,400 and $1 a year per person. So it's a huge difference. And so when we talk about water and health and safety and stuff, there's also an economic part of this. So, because you don't drink your tap water unless you trust it. And you don't drink your tap water unless you believe that it's actually safe. And so when we talk about the communities that are impacted most by this stuff, many of those communities don't have water that they trust. And as a result, they're spending more money than people with more economic resources just so they can have water to drink that they feel safe to give to their children. So, that economic reality is really powerful, I think. So if you go to the next slide. And so how do we know if our water is safe, right? So we'll get into that a little bit. So we went over on and talked about how contaminants can actually get into our water. So that could be naturally occurring, chemicals and minerals that are in the earth and could impact the water quality. But, also a lot of this is, things that humans do. So agriculture and land use practices, think pesticides and herbicides and other things that are used to grow food and protect our crops and things, but can actually get into the groundwater and, potentially hurt us. Industry, so think of all those factories that surround so many communities in LA, the car mechanic shops, the all these pollutants, everything they discharge can potentially get into our water and create urban runoff. So all that trash, the oil on the streets, all the stuff that gets gathered on our sewer drains, all that could impact the quality of our water. So there's a few different ways that could be a problem. So how often is our water tested and reported? So water agencies, so the agency or company that provides your water must test the quality quarterly, so 4 times a year. And that reporting is required by the state agency that oversees this, which is a mouthful. It's the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Drinking Water, DDW. So, each agency tests for contaminant levels. So there's all sorts of different contaminants, and the state has established a threshold for each single one that they decide if it gets exceeded, then the water is unsafe for consumption or use, right? So when that happens, it's actually called an exceedance. And so that doesn't mean that, when a contaminant is in the water, it's necessarily unhealthy or unsafe. It's just when it passes a certain level that is established by the state. So when that occurs, the water agency is required to alert the person they're providing the water to, so the ratepayer, with an explanation and also instructions on how to proceed. But we like to remind people that if you're a renter, if you don't get your water bill every month, then that means you are not getting the announcement that the water is unsafe. That's going to your landlord. And so to the renters on the call, we really recommend that you communicate with your landlord and your neighbors that you want to be alerted to these notices. It's really important, because if that message doesn't get to you, you might be consuming water that is unsafe. And I want to mention too that often, the water may be technically safe by state standards, but is not necessarily trusted by community members. And so there was, a community in Compton that was served by a water agency called Sativa, where, during testing, at times it actually didn't exceed what was deemed unsafe. However, the water was brown. And so residents obviously did not trust it and were not using it. But what ended up happening was the community came together and really rallied around this and advocated for themselves to the point where it is now being fixed and being addressed. And so, that bit about advocacy that I had earlier is important when it comes to this, to advocate, to make sure as a renter, that you're going to get that information if need be when the water is unsafe. Advocacy with your neighbors to make sure that you're talking to one another. Advocacy to know, who makes these decisions, who's overseeing this stuff. It's important because often our systems don't protect the most vulnerable. So it's important that you as an individual and as a community advocate for yourself. So this is just, a bit on drinking water quality. It's really confusing, and it's a confusing system. And so we're always available to help you understand it better and navigate that system. So, we'll pop our contact info into the chat, but we're always, open to helping you navigate this. And next slide. So that concludes the presentation, but I wanted to make another plea for you to actually take the survey if you live in LA. So join us, and we really want to hear from you, no matter where you live. We want to know what's going on in your community. We have a really nifty, clean URL there, watertalks.la, that will direct you to the survey. And it should take just 10 minutes, but it's really important, and it really sets the stage for funding and spending millions of dollars in LA. And so it's important that we hear from you, hear what you're going through, and how we, as a community, can help. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ariel, and we're available for any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. I wanted to, because a few folks came in a little later. The survey that Stephen's talking about is LA County wide. So if you live in LA County or you know anyone in LA County, send it to them to fill it out. Like he said, it's 10 minutes and it really will influence dollars and funding. A lot of this money usually is dictated by bigger state water institutions or decision makers, a few people. But we really want the power of the people here, and that's what this WaterTalks survey is all about. So it's a really easy URL, watertalks.la. Throw it on your Instagram, send it out in an email, because we're really just trying to get thousands of people to fill this survey out so that we can truly get authentic feedback from community members on what they care about most around water infrastructure, water quality, all of the things we touched on in this presentation. I mean, it's a pretty easy survey as well. I know for me, I didn't know much about water before I actually came to TreePeople. And so learning a lot about it here has been great, but it's also a very easy to understand survey that anyone could fill out. So if any folks have questions, if you could just ask them in the chat. I see a question from Jill. Are the slides available for reference? Yes, we're going to be sending out the slides and also the recording of this session in an email to you afterwards. So yes, we will make those available. And if anyone has other questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. Looks like we're good for today. So I just wanted to thank again our sponsors, Subaru of Sherman Oaks and Boeing, and the Senator Fund for really helping us to provide this information for free to community members. And I wanted to urge you guys to follow us on social media at treepeople_org, because we're always posting information, not just about water, but about everything environment related. Right now, a lot about fire ecology and what's happening with all the fires, as well as information about soil and the environment and other pieces about where we're planting trees. If you have any additional questions, please send us an email at learnathome with TreePeople at treepeople.org, and we will answer those questions for you if you have any others. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate it. I see some folks saying they're going to share the survey. We're really excited about it, and we will share the results. So stay in touch with us, sign up for our newsletter, and we'll connect with you to share the results of what community members are saying in different regions around what they care about most with water. And without further ado, I will end this session. And again, thank you everybody for coming.